Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, a small town on the island of Corsica, which had recently become French territory. Just a year earlier, in 1768, the island had been transferred from Genoa to France, making Napoleon technically a French citizen by birth, but Corsica's identity remained fiercely distinct. His parents were Carlo Bonaparte and Letizia Ramolino, both minor Corsican nobility. The family wasn't rich, but they were respected and politically active. Carlo worked as a lawyer and later served as a representative of Corsica at the court of Louis XVI in Versailles. Napoleon was the second of 8 surviving children. He grew up speaking Corsican and Italian, not French. In fact, he didn't learn French until he was almost 10, and even then, he spoke it with a strong Corsican accent for the rest of his life. From an early age, Napoleon was intelligent, solitary, and serious. He read constantly, preferring history, classical literature, and military theory. His favourite heroes were Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Hannibal. These weren't just stories for him. He saw them as models to study, copy, and eventually surpass. At age 9, his father secured a scholarship for him to study at a military school in mainland France, the Collège d'Autun, to learn French quickly, then move to the military academy at Brienne-le-Château. Napoleon was an outsider there, mocked for his accent, manners, and poverty. But he studied hard and kept to himself. By 1784, at age 15, he was accepted into the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, the elite military academy of France. There, he trained to become an artillery officer, one of the more technical branches of the military. When his father died in 1785, Napoleon was just 16 years old. He completed the 2-year military program in just 1 year, becoming a second lieutenant in the French army. But even as a young officer, he struggled with money, often living on the edge of poverty. He was brilliant at math, obsessed with order and structure, and extremely ambitious. He wasn't charismatic, not yet, but he was observant, intense, and driven. In the years to come, the world would see the results of this ambition. But for now, Napoleon Bonaparte was a young, underpaid, underestimated officer, just one of many. No one had any idea what was coming, not yet. By 1789, the French Revolution had begun. The monarchy was collapsing. The old order, the Ancien Régime, was being torn apart by debt, famine, and a rising tide of anger from the people. For many, this was a time of fear. For Napoleon Bonaparte, it was a time of opportunity. He was in his early 20s, stationed as a low-ranking artillery officer in France. At first, he watched cautiously as the revolution unfolded. But quickly, he realized something vital. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The old elite was crumbling. The future belonged to those who acted boldly, and Napoleon was ready. In 1793, he got his first real chance to prove himself. A major revolt broke out in Toulon, a coastal city in southern France. Royalists there had invited the British Navy to help them hold the city. If the British kept control of Toulon, it would be a disaster for the revolution. Napoleon, just 24 years old, was appointed to take charge of the artillery. He moved fast. He studied the terrain. He mapped enemy positions. He repositioned the cannons for maximum effect, something no one else had thought to do. His plan worked. The French retook Toulon, the British fled, and Napoleon, he was promoted on the spot from captain to brigadier general. Overnight, he went from a nobody to a name whispered with respect among the revolutionary leadership. But that was only the beginning. Then, disaster. In 1794, his main political ally, Maximilien Robespierre, was overthrown and executed. Robespierre had been one of the architects of the Reign of Terror, and once he fell, everyone connected to him was in danger. Napoleon was arrested and lost his command. He was out, finished, just another officer ruined by politics. But again, Napoleon waited, watched, and calculated. In October 1795, a massive royalist uprising broke out in Paris. The revolution was about to be overthrown. The government, called the Directory, was in panic. They needed someone to defend the city, fast. They called Napoleon. He accepted. With calm precision, he organized cannons across Paris. He ordered his men to fire grape shot, a brutal anti-personnel weapon, directly into the crowds of rebels. It was fast, bloody, and effective. The rebellion was crushed in a single day. The French government was saved. And Napoleon? He was now the hero of the revolution. At just 26 years old, he was appointed commander of the Army of the Interior. Not bad for a man who had almost been forgotten months earlier. Behind the scenes, Napoleon was also forming connections with powerful people, especially Paul Barras, one of the leading members of the Directory. Through Barras, he met Josephine de Beauharnais, a glamorous widow 6 years older than him. In 1796, they married. Josephine would become both a symbol of his rise and a burden in his future. But for now, everything was falling into place. The revolution had given Napoleon a new world to rise in, and he was just getting started. In 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte was 26 years old. He was newly married, recently promoted, and about to be given his first major command. Now, that sounds impressive. But in reality, this army was in shambles, poorly supplied, demoralized, undisciplined. For years, they had been stuck fighting in the Alps, barely surviving. No one expected greatness from them. But Napoleon did, and more importantly, he expected it from himself. From the moment he arrived in Italy, Napoleon took command with a presence no one could ignore. He gave rousing speeches to his starving troops, promising victory, glory, and riches. He cut out corrupt supply officers and reorganized the army on the spot. But his biggest weapon wasn't cannon or cavalry. It was speed. Napoleon moved faster than any general before him. He marched his men through mountain passes others thought impassable. He struck before his enemies even knew he was there. And one by one, he smashed the powerful armies of Austria and their Italian allies. In just 2 weeks, Napoleon defeated the Kingdom of Piedmont. Then he turned on the Austrians. He won battle after battle, Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli, all now etched into military history. In each case, Napoleon outmaneuvered, outthought, and outfought generals with far more experience. He often led from the front, covered in mud, sometimes even blood, shouting orders under fire. Soldiers adored him, officers feared disappointing him. His leadership was electric. Napoleon had turned the Italian campaign into a masterclass in military strategy. He didn't just defeat armies. He crushed them, humiliated them, broke their morale, and redefined modern warfare. But Napoleon wasn't just a military genius. He was also a master of image. After every victory, he sent glowing reports back to Paris, carefully written, edited, and exaggerated. French newspapers were filled with tales of Napoleon's brilliance, his courage, his unstoppable victories. He crafted a legend, even as the man behind it was still in his 20s. And the French people ate it up. Back home, they didn't see a general. They saw a hero, a savior, maybe even something more. By 1797, Napoleon had conquered northern Italy and forced Austria to negotiate peace. He personally oversaw the signing of the Treaty of Campo Formio, a rare move for a military leader. He had gone from artillery officer to France's most powerful general, all in the span of 2 years. But he didn't just bring home treaties and medals, he brought home wealth too. During his campaign, Napoleon looted cities, churches, and noble estates. He shipped priceless artwork and gold back to France, funding the French government and feeding the legend. Paris was in awe. The Directory, the ruling government, had a problem on their hands. Napoleon was no longer just a tool of the state. He was a force of his own, a man with power, popularity, and an army that worshipped him. And when such a man returns from war victorious, He's no longer just a general. He becomes something far more dangerous. By 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte was the most famous man in France. But fame brings danger. The Directory, the fragile government of the French Republic, was nervous. Napoleon had won too much, too quickly. He was young, ambitious, and popular. And worse, he had an army loyal only to him. They didn't want to fire him. That would risk revolt. So they gave him a new mission, one that sounded grand, exotic, and almost impossible: invade Egypt. To most, this seemed insane. Why Egypt? Because Napoleon wasn't just thinking about Europe anymore. He was thinking globally. The British Empire was France's mortal enemy, and their strength came from their vast overseas colonies, especially India. Napoleon's idea: cut the British trade route through Egypt, control the Nile, threaten India, break the spine of Britain's empire from the south. It was bold, risky, audacious, exactly how Napoleon liked it. In May 1798, Napoleon set sail from Toulon with an army of over 30,000 men, 300 ships, and a strange addition: 167 scholars, scientists, and artists. He wasn't just invading, he was bringing the Enlightenment. These men would document everything: geography, plants, animals, ancient ruins. Napoleon wanted to conquer with cannon and culture, to be remembered not just as a general, but as a builder of civilization. He landed in Alexandria on July 1st, 1798. Egypt, dusty, ancient, chaotic, was about to change. Napoleon's army moved swiftly across the desert toward Cairo, facing the ruling force of Egypt, the Mamluks, fierce cavalry warriors known for their speed and brutality. On July 21st, just outside Cairo, came one of Napoleon's most iconic victories: the Battle of the Pyramids. The Mamluks charged, their horses thundering across the sand. But Napoleon had already changed the rules of war. He formed his men into massive squares, bayonets on every side, artillery in the corners. The Mamluks charged and were cut down mercilessly. Napoleon won in less than an hour. He marched into Cairo a conquering hero. And there, beneath the burning Egyptian sun, he said the words that would echo for centuries: "Soldiers, from the top of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." It wasn't just a battle, it was the birth of legend. But Napoleon's dream of empire would not go unchallenged. While he was busy taking Cairo, Admiral Horatio Nelson of the British Royal Navy was hunting him. On August 1st, 1798, Nelson found Napoleon's fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay, and he destroyed it. The Battle of the Nile was a total disaster for France. Nelson sank or captured nearly every French ship. Thousands died, supplies were lost, and most importantly, Napoleon was trapped in Egypt. He could not go home. He could not bring reinforcements. His empire in the east had become a prison. For the next year, Napoleon fought not just battles, but reality. He clashed with Ottoman forces in Syria, besieged cities, marched his men through endless deserts. He won battles, yes, but at great cost. At Jaffa, he ordered hundreds of prisoners executed. In Acre, he faced brutal resistance and suffered a humiliating defeat. His army was ravaged by plague, hunger, and exhaustion. The scholar's dream had turned into a nightmare. By mid-1799, Napoleon realized something crucial. The war in Egypt no longer mattered. France was falling apart. Back home, the government was crumbling. Enemies were rising. The people were desperate for stability, order, and hope. And Napoleon saw his chance. Without telling the government, without even informing many of his own officers, he secretly left Egypt aboard a small frigate, dodging the British Navy all the way home. On October 9th, 1799, he stepped back onto French soil. He had lost Egypt, but he had returned with something far more important: a destiny to fulfill. By late 1799, when Napoleon Bonaparte returned from Egypt, the French Republic was crumbling under its own weight. The revolution had devoured itself. The ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity were now buried beneath corruption, fear, and failure. The people were tired, the politicians were paralyzed, and the army was waiting for a savior. That savior had just stepped off the boat, sunburnt, scarred, and more dangerous than ever. The government at the time was called the Directory, a 5-man executive body meant to balance power. But in truth, it was a mess of incompetence and backroom deals. The French economy was on the brink of collapse. Royalists wanted the king back. Jacobins still dreamed of terror. And ordinary citizens were starving, exhausted by a decade of blood and promises. France didn't need another philosopher. It needed a man of action, a man like Napoleon. Napoleon returned to France on October 9th, 1799, and within a month he had engineered a coup. But it wasn't chaos. It was surgical. He partnered with 2 key players. Emmanuel Sieyès, a powerful politician who wanted to reform the system. Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon's younger brother and president of the Council of 500. Together, they would rewrite the future of France, in secret. The plan? A coup d'état disguised as constitutional reform. The date was set, 18 Brumaire, Year 8, November 9th, 1799. At dawn, soldiers loyal to Napoleon took control of key buildings in Paris, the council chambers, the ministries, the streets. They spread a false rumour: a Jacobite uprising was imminent. The members of the legislature were moved to Saint-Cloud outside Paris for protection. What they didn't realise was they were walking into a trap. The next day, 19 Brumaire, Napoleon himself entered the Council of 500. But something went wrong. He expected applause. He got outrage. The council turned violent. Some members shouted, "Down with the dictator." Others physically lunged at him. Napoleon stumbled, shaken, his coat torn. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He fled the chamber. The coup was falling apart. But then Napoleon Bonaparte stepped forward. Lucien, with ice in his veins, stood before the troops guarding the building. He lied, brilliantly. He declared, "My brother is under threat inside by armed terrorists. The council is no longer safe. Soldiers, expel the traitors." And they did. Napoleon's men stormed the chamber, drove out the council, and dissolved the government by force. There were no democratic debates, no speeches, just bayonets. By the end of the day, the Directory was dead. In its place, a new government, the consulate, led by 3 men. But only one mattered: Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of France. In name, France was still a republic. In reality, it was now a military dictatorship wearing a democratic mask. And the people, they didn't rise up. They didn't protest. They cheered. Because after years of chaos and blood, Napoleon offered something no one else could: order. As first consul, Napoleon moved with the speed of a genius. He reformed the tax system, reorganized the legal code, brought back the Catholic Church. By 1802, he had reshaped France with the sharp edge of reform and the sharper edge of a bayonet. He was first consul for life. He controlled the military, the law, the press, and the people. But still, he wanted more. He didn't just want to rule. He wanted to be the state. And so Napoleon set his sights on something once thought unthinkable in post-revolutionary France: a crown. In May 1804, after months of manoeuvring and manipulation, the Senate proposed a new title: Emperor of the French. But Napoleon knew appearances mattered. He didn't seize the crown in the night. He held a referendum. The result? A staggering 3.5 million voted yes. Fewer than 3,000 dared to vote no. Whether it was real democracy or carefully staged theatre didn't matter. The people had spoken. France would have an emperor. The date was set: December 2nd, 1804. The location, Notre Dame Cathedral, Paris. Even the Pope himself, Pius VII, travelled from Rome to bless the event. It was tradition, a holy ritual, a sacred moment where the church crowns the monarch. But Napoleon had a different plan. As the Pope lifted the crown, Napoleon took it from his hands, turned to the crowd, and placed it on his own head. He crowned himself, then he crowned Josephine, his wife, Empress. It was more than symbolic, it was a message to the world. I owe this throne to no one but myself. Everything about Napoleon's coronation was a performance. The robes were Roman. The crown echoed Charlemagne. The paintings commissioned afterward made him look like a divine emperor from antiquity, and yet he was still, in essence, a soldier from Corsica. This was the genius of Napoleon. He wrapped military dictatorship in the silk robes of imperial majesty and made it look like destiny. The revolution was dead, the republic was buried, and in its place stood a man who had beaten the odds, bent history, and built an empire from ambition alone. Napoleon now ruled over 70 million people. He restructured education, promoted science, and introduced a legal system that would influence countries around the world, the Napoleonic Code. He signed a concordat with the Pope to bring peace to the Church while secretly maintaining state control. He created the Bank of France, stabilized the currency, built roads, bridges, canals, and forged a modern France from the chaos of revolution. For many, life under Napoleon was better. For others, especially the nobility of Europe, it was a threat. They saw him not as a saviour, but as a monster rising from the ashes of revolution. The crowned heads of Europe knew what was coming next. War. With his empire declared, Napoleon was no longer content with France alone. He turned outward, to Austria, to Prussia, to Britain, to the world. "I am the revolution," he once said. "I am the empire." And for the next 10 years he would conquer, command, and reshape the face of Europe with blood, steel, and brilliance. But every empire casts a shadow, and every rise has a fall. December 2nd, 1805. Exactly 1 year after crowning himself emperor, Napoleon lit the sky with the greatest battlefield victory of his life. Austerlitz. One word, one day. And yet, it would change the map of Europe forever. Napoleon's coronation had alarmed the monarchies of Europe. Austria, Russia, Britain, they saw in him not just a threat, but a disease, an infection of revolution spreading beyond France. And so, they formed the Third Coalition. Austria gathered its armies. Russia marched its troops westward. Britain funded it all with gold. Napoleon, aware of the gathering storm, struck first. Napoleon led his Grande Armée across Europe like a thunderbolt. 200,000 men, unmatched discipline, and a rhythm of march, fight, march again. In just 6 weeks he crossed the Rhine, outflanked the Austrians, and forced the surrender of an entire army at Ulm. By the time the coalition realized what had happened, he was already outside Vienna, but it was near the town of Austerlitz in modern-day Czech Republic that the fate of Europe would be decided. The stage is set, 3 emperors, 1 destiny. Napoleon faced 2 emperors, Francis II of Austria and Alexander I of Russia. Their combined army numbered over 90,000. Napoleon, just 68,000, outnumbered, outgunned, but not outmatched. He studied the terrain, feigned weakness, and lured them into a trap. "If they make a false move," Napoleon whispered, "I shall destroy them." Dawn broke on December 2nd with a fog so thick you could barely see 10 meters ahead. Napoleon let the Allies take the high ground. He wanted them there. They believed he had left his right flank vulnerable. A mistake. But it wasn't. It was bait. As the Allies surged forward to crush his weak right, Napoleon unleashed his main assault at their centre, seizing the Pratzen Heights, the commanding ground. From there, his forces split the enemy army in two. Confusion, collapse, chaos. Entire divisions were cut off, surrounded or drowned in the frozen lakes. In a single day, Napoleon annihilated the Third Coalition. The casualties? Napoleon. 9,000. Allies? Over 36,000. The Austrian emperor sued for peace. The Russians fled east, humiliated, and the Holy Roman Empire, a 1,000-year-old institution, was dissolved the following year. From the ashes, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, tightening his grip over Central Europe. He was no longer just Emperor of the French, he was master of the continent. They called it the Sun of Austerlitz, a light so bright, it blinded an entire generation, but with every conquest came resistance. Spain simmered, Prussia seethed, Britain refused to bend, its navy ruling the seas. Napoleon believed Austerlitz had secured his place in history, but in truth, it was the beginning of a cycle he would repeat again and again: war, victory, reshaping the map, and enemies regrouping. The empire he built stood on shifting sands, and though Austerlitz was a triumph of genius, it gave birth to overconfidence. Napoleon had defeated emperors. Now he believed he could defeat anyone, anywhere, even the impossible, even Russia. Napoleon believed he was untouchable. After Austerlitz, after Tilsit, after creating kings and crushing coalitions, he thought he could bend the world to his will. But in 1808, he made a move that would bleed his empire like 1,000 tiny cuts. He invaded Spain, not with fire and rage, but with arrogance. And that arrogance would cost him everything. Spain had been an ally, a weak and dysfunctional monarchy, but not an enemy. Napoleon didn't trust their king, Charles IV, nor his son Ferdinand, so he called them both to a meeting in Bayonne and forced them to abdicate. Then he did something bold. He made his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, the King of Spain. He thought the Spanish people would accept it. They didn't. They rose up. In Madrid on May 2nd, civilians attacked French troops in the streets. Shopkeepers, farmers, priests, children, with knives, clubs, whatever they had. The French retaliated with mass executions. That day, Francisco Goya, the painter, witnessed horror. He painted it later in blood and darkness. The 3rd of May 1808. The Spanish had declared war, not with formal armies, but with ambushes, snipers, assassinations. It wasn't a war Napoleon understood. It wasn't on open fields. It wasn't won with strategy. It was everywhere, and it never stopped. The word guerrilla literally means little war, was born in Spain. Small bands of fighters would strike French supply lines, kill soldiers, and vanish into mountains and villages. French soldiers were never safe. Not in cities, not in roads, not in their sleep. Napoleon poured in more troops, 100,000, then 200,000. But the more he sent, the more resistance grew, and behind it all, Britain. While Napoleon was distracted with Austria and Prussia, the British sent a calm, calculating general to aid the Spanish resistance, Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington. He brought money, weapons, and strategy. He trained Spanish and Portuguese troops, led surgical strikes, and began liberating cities one by one. Napoleon's generals, his marshals, were outmaneuvered. For the first time, French troops were retreating. And Napoleon, he wasn't even in Spain. In late 1808, Napoleon personally arrived to fix the war. He won battles, he stormed cities, he forced enemies back. But it didn't end the war, because Spain was a wound that never healed. And Napoleon had to leave again. Austria was rising up. So he left Spain in the hands of his marshals. Again. They couldn't hold it. What did Spain cost Napoleon? 300,000 French casualties, billions of francs in wasted resources, and worst of all, it tied down troops he would need elsewhere. It emboldened his enemies. It proved that Napoleon could bleed. As the Spanish resistance grew, so did the myth. The emperor is not invincible. And back in Paris, the people whispered. The empire was too big, the wars too many, the enemies too stubborn. But Napoleon, he still believed in his destiny, still believed that if he struck hard enough, fast enough, he could end it all. There was one enemy left, one challenge that haunted him. Russia. By 1812, Napoleon stood at the height of his empire. He controlled most of Europe, from Spain to Poland, from the Netherlands to Naples. But behind the gold and marble of his victories, something cracked. His greatest enemy, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, had grown restless. They had once been allies after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. But the continental system, Napoleon's blockade of British trade, had choked the Russian economy. Alexander withdrew. He reopened ports to Britain. Napoleon saw it as a betrayal. And so, he decided to do what few had dared. He would invade Russia. He thought it would be another Austerlitz, quick, decisive, glorious. But what awaited him was a white, endless graveyard. In June 1812, Napoleon launched the most massive military invasion Europe had ever seen. 600,000 soldiers, men from 20 different nations, stretching nearly 70 miles long. This was the Grande Armée, a monster of war marching eastward. Napoleon believed he would strike fast, defeat the Russian army and force Tsar Alexander to the peace table. But the Russians had no intention of fighting, not yet. As Napoleon advanced, the Russian army, led by General Kutuzov, retreated. They burned everything behind them. Farms, towns, bridges, all in flames. No shelter, no food, just endless forests, mud and silence. Napoleon kept pushing. He needed a decisive battle. And then, he got it. On September 7th, 1812, near the village of Borodino, the Russian army made a stand. It was the bloodiest single-day battle of the Napoleonic Wars. Over 70,000 men killed or wounded in one day. Cannons tore limbs, horses screamed, soldiers drowned in blood and smoke. Napoleon won, technically, but it wasn't a crushing victory. The Russian army retreated in order, not chaos. And worse, the road to Moscow now lay open. On September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow. But the city was silent. The Russians had evacuated it and set it on fire. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as flames devoured the city. No food, no supplies, no message from the Tsar. He waited 5 weeks for a surrender that never came. Winter began to whisper. In October, Napoleon gave the order, retreat. It was the beginning of hell. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Horses froze where they stood. Men marched barefoot in snow, eyes hollow, fingers black with frostbite. Russian Cossacks hunted the retreating columns like wolves. Villagers killed stragglers. Typhus, starvation, cannibalism. One French officer wrote, "We walked over dead men, beside dying men, under a sky that hated us." Out of 600,000, only about 100,000 made it out. Some estimates say as few as 10,000 were still fit for battle. Napoleon, the Emperor of Europe, had been shattered by a land he never understood. Napoleon reached Paris in December 1812. He had abandoned his men, racing ahead on a sleigh, trying to save the image of an invincible emperor. But the myth was broken. Europe watched and smelled blood. Prussia rebelled. Austria turned. Britain armed. Russia marched west. The empire Napoleon had built with fire and genius began to collapse under the weight of its own ambition. Yet he still believed he could win. From the sublime to the ridiculous, he once said, is but a step. And in 1813, that step would come. The nations of Europe would unite for a final reckoning. Napoleon had faced death many times. He had stared down cannons, crossed mountains, defied kings. But after Russia, the myth was broken. The eagle no longer soared. He was bleeding, surrounded, and hunted. But he wasn't done, not yet. Napoleon returned from Russia and tried to rebuild, and incredibly, he did. By spring 1813, he had raised another army, though younger, weaker, and far less experienced. But the rest of Europe had had enough. Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, Sweden all joined forces in the Sixth Coalition. In October 1813, the largest battle in European history until World War I unfolded. The Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations. Napoleon faced over 300,000 coalition troops. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, out of time. He lost, and now the road to Paris was open. By early 1814, coalition forces marched into France. Napoleon fought like a ghost, appearing, striking, vanishing. He still had brilliance, still had instinct, but the numbers were crushing. On March 31st, 1814, Paris fell for the first time in centuries. French generals urged surrender. Napoleon tried to rally his men to march on the capital again, but they refused. He was no longer emperor, he was a memory. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated the throne. The Allies did not kill him. Instead, they exiled him to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. He was given a small army, a palace, a staff, and the title Emperor of Elba. It was almost a joke. Napoleon was 44 years old, still sharp, still watching, still dangerous, and in France, things were falling apart again. Less than a year after his exile, Napoleon escaped Elba. On March 1st, 1815, he landed on the southern coast of France with just 1,000 men. Louis XVIII, the restored Bourbon king, sent troops to stop him. But when they met Napoleon face to face, he opened his coat and said, "If any of you would shoot your emperor, here I am." They joined him. Napoleon marched to Paris, gaining soldiers every step of the way. By the time he arrived, he had regained his throne without firing a single shot. Thus began the most daring and doomed chapter of his life, the 100 Days. Europe panicked. The Seventh Coalition formed in weeks. Napoleon moved fast, determined to defeat them before they united. On June 18th, 1815, near a small Belgian village called Waterloo, Napoleon faced the combined forces of the Duke of Wellington, British, Gebhard von Blücher, Prussian. It was pouring rain. The battlefield was a muddy grave. Napoleon had the old fire in him. His men fought with belief, but mistakes were made. Delays, miscommunications, overconfidence. And then the Prussians arrived. The French lines collapsed. The old guard, Napoleon's most elite soldiers, made a final stand. They were butchered. Waterloo was a total defeat. Napoleon returned to Paris, but it was over. On June 22nd, 1815, he abdicated again. This time there would be no island escape. He tried to flee to America, but the British intercepted him. Napoleon surrendered, writing, "I come to throw myself on the protection of the most powerful, the most constant, and the most generous of my enemies, the British people." They didn't believe a word of it. The British exiled Napoleon to a rock in the middle of the Atlantic, St. Helena, 1,200 miles from Africa, windswept, isolated, guarded by warships. There, the man who once ruled Europe became a prisoner in paradise. For 6 years, he walked the cliffs, wrote his memoirs, and argued with British officers. He grew fat, sick, bitter. And on May 5th, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died. Some say stomach cancer, others whisper poison. His final words: France, army, head of the army, Josephine. Napoleon is one of the most controversial figures in history, a dictator, a genius, a tyrant, a reformer. He killed millions, yet spread laws, rights, and revolutions across Europe. He crowned himself emperor, yet insisted he fought for liberty. To some, he was a monster. To others, a hero. But one thing is certain, he changed the world, from a poor Corsican boy to the ruler of Europe, to a lonely exile on a forgotten island. Napoleon Bonaparte's life was nothing less than a legend, and legends never truly die. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who loves history, and most importantly, tell us in the comments, which historical figure should we cover next? Your suggestions shape the next chapter in our journey through time, and until then, stay curious.